We want to welcome everybody to our latest CBAN summit, or I should say CBAN Lunch and Learn. The summit was supposed to happen in March, but it got COVID. So we're back with our series of webinars here, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this month. The topic is digital inclusion, and I'm Curtis Dean with the Community Broadband Action Network. My co-founder is also going to be participating here, Todd Kilkoff. And our panelists and guests today are Christopher Mitchell and Katie Kienbaum with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. So there we are all together, and thank you very much, Katie and Christopher, for coming on and joining us. I appreciate it, taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I thought a great way to talk about digital inclusion, I found a little thing on the internet that really kind of illustrates what we're talking about here. I think you can see the screen. This is an article in the on the New York Times Online. Parking lots have become digital lifeline. With cafes and libraries closed, Americans without internet access are sitting outside them to get free and fast connections. And here's somebody trying to get some work done, because she probably doesn't have internet at home, and so she's sitting outside of a school in this case, but libraries have also become that important lifeline for people. That's really kind of a picture that kind of illustrates some of the challenges that we face in America with the haves and the have-nots when it comes to access to internet, access to technology, access to the digital economy, and that's the topic of today's discussion. So thank you again, Christopher and Katie, for joining us. So thought we'd just kind of start off, either of you, Christopher or Katie, give me what's your best definition of digital inclusion?
Go ahead, Katie.
So digital inclusion is just basically the practice of ensuring that everyone has access to internet access to appropriate devices, and access to digital literacy training, and just the know-how on how to use the internet access and to use the devices they're given.
Yeah, and I would just say that what Katie just described, we sometimes think of as a three-legged stool. And I don't know that ISPs are necessarily the ones to provide all three of those, although I think they should be involved with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to say that in the chat, as we were getting ready for this, you all said that my hair looked better than yours, and I'm looking at us together. There's no way that that is true. Now I'm very embarrassed.
Katie, I think Katie wins.
Definitely.
I did brush today.
Mine's just a little shaggier than I'm used to, and I'm considering going back to the summer buzz cut, but my wife hasn't quite let me pull that trigger yet. So the wall clippers stay locked in the cabinet until future notice. So the three-legged stool, that's access to internet, access to the devices to use on the internet. What's the other leg of that stool?
Know-how or literacy.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about literacy first, if we could. I know that in a number of the communities that Todd and I have been involved with, is their process of evaluating their broadband needs. And I'm sure the two of you and all the research that you've done, there's just a pretty significant percentage of the American population that has a certain, whether it be a phobia of technology or they just don't understand why it's important to them. Let's talk about maybe some ways that nut can be cracked so that people can take advantage of the digital economy and everything it brings to us.
Yeah, I'd just like to, let me start with a comment, and then I'd like to give it to Katie to talk about the actual stuff that we've seen. Mm-hmm. I think it's worth noting that you're right. There are these different groups of people that are not connected. And I think it's also worth noting they really don't like being confused for each other. People who know why they'd like to be online but are not able to get online are extremely frustrated when it's assumed that they just don't understand the value of the internet. And similarly, people who may not be that interested, they say we don't care as much, but it's just, you want to be very careful that you don't assume people don't understand the value of it. And I think one of the things that, as Katie talks about, some of the things we've seen from different community approaches to spreading this know-how, it's in some ways sales or marketing, but I think it should be more focused on the community benefit side than just acquiring new customers. But it's not something that is altruistic, really. It's something that will actually help a network.
Right. And that access to technology, we'll talk about that in a minute. You need all legs of that stool, and it would seem to me that that literacy part is maybe end up in some ways the toughest nut to challenge, because it's not a dollar and cents item like, say, access might be, where if you can get enough money, you can build the networks to give everybody access. But there's still going to be a group of people that the literacy is lower and aren't taking advantage of that.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Go ahead, Katie.
I think, yeah, the literacy portion of it is definitely a much more nuanced conversation, and often involves ongoing action to try to address it. It's not, you can't just, build a network and be done with it. You have to continuously reach out to new communities, get more folks online, get them the education that they need to succeed and have beneficial experiences once they do have internet access. And so how we see a lot of communities, especially communities with municipal networks, addressing this is by partnering with existing organizations in the community. Right. They're usually the ones with the most experience and know-how. So by combining efforts, they're able to, reach out to different folks that might need this service. And I think that's also part of it, is that there are different groups of people. Sometimes it's just seniors. They might need different help and different technological training than maybe low-income households or families with students, young students that
recent immigrants.
Recent immigrants, folks that don't speak English as their first language. So it can be, partnering with one or more community organizations that are offering these services. Oftentimes it can be just agencies that actually already do other things, like local libraries or
Right.
local agencies on aging.
Can I just, I think libraries is the key there, because I think a number of the smaller communities may be thinking, well, if I was in Des Moines, there may be an organization I could partner with, but a really good stop is a library. Another that's common, I don't know, I mean, Iowa's hyper literate, so I would assume that there's just libraries everywhere, but also in a number of states, we see extension agencies, extensions of the university system also being good partners for this.
Yeah, and certainly we have a very strong extension service here in Iowa. Jay Peterson, who's a C-band member that Todd and I have had many conversations with, works for the state of Iowa library system. And we've often talked about how libraries are this key community link to everything, to the world, right? The world of knowledge. And it's amazing how libraries have become this lifeline for so many people. It's always been a lifeline for learning, right? Because of books and whatnot. But now in the age of technology, it's become a lifeline for people who don't have access to it at home. But even libraries struggle with access. So let's talk about that next, because getting access to fast, affordable, reliable, ubiquitous broadband is a very big challenge in this country right now. And if you're going to be included in the digital economy, you have to be able to get online. So let's talk a little bit about the role that municipal networks are playing in expanding access across the country. Christopher, Katie, your organization is doing an excellent job, amazing advocacy work over the years, and also tracking the advent of municipal networks. What are the trends you're seeing there?
We are definitely seeing more understand. I mean, let me start that over again, because I think it's worth noting.
Yep.
Municipal networks have long been a network type that we've supported because it focuses on community needs rather than just getting the maximum amount of revenue. Now, I think smaller networks in particular, and networks that are younger, are really focused on making sure they're able to make all their payments. It's a struggle in the early years. As they get past that, and some, will continue having really tight margins even after that. But I think one of the goals should be figuring out how to give back in the form of special programs that may be available to people who hit certain income levels,
Sure.
or something that I think that is new as a reaction to COVID-19, but we may see more of, which is a real focus on how can we make sure that people have access to Wi-Fi at no charge in places that are safe and secure. Just as an example, this morning there's an article in the Pioneer Press here in St. Paul about Land O'Lakes across Minnesota, 120 parking lots of their facilities now,
Wow.
and encouraging other businesses as well. So I would expect in a few months we'll see a lot more of these, where like John Deere dealerships, all kinds of
Hmm.
businesses in ag producer areas, and other areas as well, making that small expense to make Wi-Fi available in their parking lots. Well, municipal networks could do that. They could partner in ways of doing that. This is something that would have seemed odd 2 months ago, but now is a reality of one way to bring people online more. But Katie's done more work with more traditional approaches in terms of what we've seen from different communities, both in and outside of Iowa.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
share with us, Katie.
and so I think Chris alluded to this, but just historically, one of the great benefits of municipal networks, in terms of how they're focused on the community instead of just profit maximization, is that they're more likely to expand services to the entire community, or at least, be in that process of trying to connect the entire city. They
Right.
tend not to purposefully pick out just affluent neighborhoods to serve. So that's, just part of it, because we've seen in other cities. I think we just did some research into Baltimore, where Verizon expanded its Fios network all around in the suburbs and completely left out the city of Baltimore. So municipal networks, just are more likely to make sure that everyone's connected. And then just in terms of affordability, I think there's quite a few networks that have taken steps to offer lower cost programs, either targeted towards perhaps public housing facilities or
Hmm.
to families with students, to make that more accessible for their community members. Because I think there's some debate on why most folks aren't connected, whether it's this literacy question, or the desire to actually have access, or whether it's affordability. And I think we're seeing more and more evidence that affordability is a major, if not the most major aspect of that.
Yeah, I would just add to that. If you look at different polls, they'll say different things. If you talk to the people who are working with these communities that are not online, they will say it's affordability. Someone
Mm.
might say, "Oh, it's not as important to me," and I'll tell you, having a Lamborghini isn't very important to me. It's an academic question because I cannot afford it. But at a certain point, there's different psychological reactions that people will have, in which they don't want to say, I choose not to have internet in my home because I don't think it's important for my kids to, be better at school. That's not something they're going to say. They're going to come up with a reason to cover that.
Really good
Um,
point.
so I think it's worth noting that surveys can be different, but we consistently see groups that work with these populations that are not online say it really is about affordability. And it's not to say if we lowered the price for everyone right now, it would not solve the problem. There are other barriers. It's just that is the biggest one right now.
And it's difficult to tackle any literacy or know-how hurdle if you don't have access to it in the first
Right.
place.
Right. I don't know
Um,
what you're missing at that point.
exactly.
One of the things
And
I've always
so
go ahead, Christopher.
that was a really good comment, Curtis, because I think it's worth noting. One of the things that'll be fascinating is whether these programs that are extending the no cost for 60 days access to people will significantly change the number of people who are part of the group that just doesn't understand why it's valuable.
Right.
So that's going to give us some interesting data over the next few months.
Yeah, certainly COVID has given us all an opportunity to, it's almost like a study in human nature in a way, because it's really showed us, it's really created a forced, against our will, forced us to do things that we weren't used to. And part of that, I think, with some people is simply just becoming more literate about how to use technology to communicate. When you look at, we're doing this webinar on Zoom, and Zoom has exploded over the past few weeks and months in usage. And it's not all people like us talking business or anything. It's people getting on the line and having virtual family reunions and virtual college reunions and all that. So it's really quite a variety of different uses that are going on, and all of that needing access. You mentioned affordability. Let's talk a little bit more about that, because one of the challenges I've always faced with when I've talked to people in communities is affordability it's really in the eye of the beholder, right? What's affordable to me may not be affordable to a person who's operating, on a fixed wage or a fixed income. So how do we define affordability in a way that gets people the service that they want and need, while still producing enough revenue to pay for expensive networks that are needed to be built?
Do you want to jump into that, Katie?
It's like you said, it's different for everyone, so it's hard. You can't put just a specific number on it. When we're talking about in terms of low income access, we often think of $10 a month as really a good goal as in terms of pricing, as something that we think that kind of is where it starts to tip, and more folks are able to add that into their monthly budget. But of course, sorry.
I'm sorry. I want to chime in on that point before you moved on to another one.
Yeah, go for it.
For a network that has 30,000 subs, doing $10 a month can be much more feasible than if you have 2,500 subs.
Right.
It's also a difference of whether you're talking about $10 a month for a single family home connection, or in an apartment building or public housing situation. Wilson, North Carolina is one of the best municipal networks in our history of studying this, that really has found different ways of trying to get at these low income populations. They started with a program that focused on public housing, where they could do one building, and the cost of on a per unit basis is much more reasonable. And they partnered with the public housing agency. And so I think one of the things that I would encourage people to do is not to run away from the idea of $10 a month, but to think, how can we segment this out? Like, is there a place in which we could start to try to do a low cost offer like that? Or, is there a potential partner? And Katie's actually done more work than me in like Longmont, which has an arrangement working with local philanthropy, for instance.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Let's talk about that part of it. Katie.
Yeah. So, like Chris said, Wilson is providing, I think it's 50 megabits per second symmetrical services to public housing units for only $10 a month, which is great. Longmont has, and another note on Wilson, I think they said that about half or over half of residents do take up that service. So compared to, coming from nothing beforehand to that, I think it can help pencil it out. In terms of Longmont, they actually partnered with a local philanthropic organization to fund their program, which offers free connections to families, low-income families with students in the local school district. And I believe Cedar Falls may have done something similar with funding source for another program that offers low-cost connections to families with students. But folks can donate into those programs. They get funding from local foundations. So that's another option for covering the cost of the low-income connections if the municipal network isn't able to absorb that kind of cost.
Now, Curtis, go ahead.
Yeah, I think
it's
been two components to it. One being that you need to bundle up the substitution services for entertainment into that one expense. So the more you can add to it, that you're reducing your other household expenses on such things as, what we found was going to movies, things like that. If you could bring that back inside the home, then you can actually use existing cash flow out to benefit having a wider connection, a wider access of knowledge. And then also, as you talk about the foundation model, it's really saying that it's recognizing that not all the benefits, revenue-wise to a community are going to show up on that telecom's balance sheet.
Yep.
So it doesn't really matter whether what it comes from, but if you're raising tax base, you're raising income levels, you're reducing teenage delinquency, you're reducing these things, find a pot of money together to centralize in order to give that access to help that that next generation or whatever move up the ladder economically. So there's really a two-pronged approach there to get that connection driven down.
There's so many different ways to go from there. One I would just add on to that with the community balance sheet is if you're in a place that has a strong hospital that might be interested in some interesting partnerships or things like that, the benefits of telehealth are so substantial that,
Right.
I mean, you talk about if the cost of a home connection over the course of a year for your standard tier is on the order of, let's say, $600, $700, $800, that is a fraction of a hospital procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, if you can get connections out to high risk populations, people with diabetes is a common one, and you can show improved outcomes. Those are the kinds of programs that I feel like there might be opportunities to get grant funding for, or some sort of opportunity to get efforts to work with hospitals to show that this can really help. And in some ways, they may then be able to contribute or be willing to contribute to pay for some of those connections in certain situations.
Yeah, especially for what we found is if they're driving the discussion about how the disabled are living on the outskirts because housing is typically cheaper, out in at least rural communities, your smaller ones where they don't have access. But then when that access isn't there for either, you're having just a lot of risk factors that you're imposing on that disabled population who typically is on a fixed lower income. And if you can help solve those problems, like you said, find alternative ways to add value to the proposition.
There's a program here in Iowa called Project Share, and that's directed where you can donate money that helps offset the cost for persons who have trouble paying their heating bill, for example.
Right. LIHEAP is a national program that's similar.
LIHEAP, and then some utilities voluntarily will contribute from their consumers. So something like that might be a way to kind of almost crowdsource that access so that that people can get access without a provider balking necessarily at losing money. What about Lifeline? Lifeline was supposed to be by now benefiting low-income persons on their internet bill. Is that working?
Can I quickly jump in really quick?
I want to push Lifeline down for a couple minutes if we could. So go ahead.
It's important, but so you said some utilities do have these, I think they usually refer to it as roundup or, programs where folks can donate a little extra money, maybe round up their bill to the next dollar and donate that extra money to a fund to support folks that are having problems paying their electric bills. And I think I'd have to check. I believe NextLight is doing that with their program, not necessarily rounding it up since, their bills are consistent, unlike with electric, but they are allowing folks to donate through their monthly bills to the program.
That's right. Yep, they're and that works. I think it may unlock a match, and this is something that we've talked about in Minneapolis. Trying to get the city to support. If you were able to demonstrate a significant community buy-in to create a fund, if the city would then help stretch it out, and the ISP would take a small hit rather than the entire hit. There's ways of doing that. Before you come to Lifeline, which I think is really important, and we want to talk about, I do want to know, one of the other things is in terms of keeping the cost down and making this not ruin you financially, is there's a couple of things you can do to try to minimize the expenses for low-income folks. And one is, for instance, in Wilson, they have the public housing agency manage the routers. And we see this also in San Francisco, where public-private partnership with a local company, Monkey Brains, that's a very well thought of WISP. They they've kept their costs down in part by having they had philanthropy donated modems, and then they work with the building management so that the ISP doesn't have to distribute them, doesn't have to track them, when people
Right.
are coming in and out of the facilities, because these are populations that will move more often. So if you have a partner that you can push that off onto, that's great. The other thing is frontline service help. The biggest cost driver of giving a connection to someone in these populations seems to be help desk. And so if you can have someone from a partner agency or the library that's going to be the first line to help someone when they don't know, why their internet access isn't working because of a problem with the browser they're using or something like that, that's also going to keep your costs down and help you be able to expand that connection to more folks.
And that would tie really nicely in with, any digital literacy training
Sure.
you're working on with a partner.
Make it part of that process of digital literacy training. Okay, you've learned now why access to technology and digital economy is important. Now here are the tools to get you online.
Right. And then for the next year or something like that, when you have a problem, you call us first rather than
Right,
calling
right.
the city of, X municipal fiber network.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the challenges, and I think Todd knows about this too, that we face here in Iowa is, of course, we have municipal telecom utilities all over the place, but the way Iowa law is structured, they cannot charge a different rate for someone because of their income. And that has created some challenges with doing any kind of low income tier or low income offering. And so, that's something policymakers, maybe not just in Iowa, there are probably other areas where it's like that, need to maybe address the fact that give a local entity the flexibility to do what they feel is right for their community. So.
Now, one way also to consider this is to speak with attorneys to vet this, but it would also be for the ISP potentially to donate certain services to a partner organization and have them distribute them. There might be ways to work around that. I think it's going to depend on your attorney in many cases. Yes.
The Lifeline, which we'll go back to now, is a program that is originally designed to subsidize telephone service for low-income households, and the goal has been to reposition that so it can also be used to subsidize internet service for low-income households. So, what is the status of Lifeline for broadband?
Embattled. Katie, I don't know. I mean, usually I take the more federal type stuff. So I'm happy to field this, but jump in as you wish. As Obama's administration was leaving office, they sought to change Lifeline considerably, among other things, to not require telephone service. And this actually gets back to the net neutrality Title II debate, because statute requires Lifeline to be used for a telecommunications service. So I believe there's still some flexibility to apply it toward broadband service, but it has to be from a provider that's an ETC, which typically requires a telephone service to be involved one way or another. That was going to be made, I would say, easier, and then also is going to be made more possible to aggregate customers. So if you had an entire building in which everyone would be a Lifeline eligible because it was a low-income housing facility or something like that, it would have been much easier and lower paperwork to be able to reimburse everyone, basically, to make it easier on ISPs to do that sort of thing. That stuff more or less all got thrown out by the current FCC, who is very focused on waste, fraud, and abuse. I think I frankly cheer anytime that we catch those who are defrauding this system. I frankly think there should be greater penalties, and I'm excited that this administration has pursued those cases. However, I don't think the administration has done very much to expand or improve upon the Lifeline program. And furthermore, there's a real challenge that goes beyond just that simple discussion to how the entire Universal Service Fund is funded.
Yes.
And I'm sure that any ISPs are well aware of the contribution factor and the challenges. And so it's not like we can just say, let's make $30 a month available to families. There's no means of doing that currently.
Yeah.
But there is a discussion and an effort to create a federal broadband subsidy that would be appropriated through Congress and would be more sizable and would frankly be really wonderful, I think, for ISPs that would like to offer a $10 a month program or free, but can't do it by foregoing revenue.
And
Now, go ahead, Katie.
Part of the issue with relying on Lifeline for just using it for broadband access is that when families have to choose between using that Lifeline subsidy for a cell phone plan,
Right.
broadband access, usually the cell phone wins out just because it's portable and it meets other needs too. So that's also kind of part of the problem with the current Lifeline structure.
It's the current structure basically treats a cell phone as just another phone line and not really recognizing the fact that mobility is a totally different thing than, just voice communications. It's
families have to choose which service they'd like to apply the subsidy to.
Wasn't there another aspect of Lifeline that was, I think, still in flux? Was this verification system? It used to be the provider was the person who had to verify the income through various means, and that they were going to a centralized verification system. Did that ever get hammered out?
I wish I had checked into that. I had thought they launched it for some states, and I don't know. It was
kind of in beta, I think.
Right. So I'm afraid that I can't say for sure.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm also not entirely sure, but I do feel like there was some concerns that not all of the eligibility statuses, systems for verifying eligibility had been tied in. So it might show folks as ineligible when in fact they are eligible, because not all of the databases are included yet.
And it's also worth noting that Lifeline is a program that is available to many more people than take advantage of it. And so that may be another way to at least give a discount to people. Many cities are already offering services that are quite affordable relative to what those of us pay without competition or real choice or community ownership. So, if you're able to just take $9.25 off of that, you do have to offer telephone service. You have to have qualifying levels of service. There's a number of hoops to jump through, but there may be a significant number of people who are not aware of the program who would qualify for it.
So one of the themes of really this discussion is how municipal networks are playing a key role in solving for digital inclusion. And you've mentioned a couple of great examples like Wilson, North Carolina. What are some of the barriers to getting more municipal networks so that we can have more digital inclusion, especially in some of these areas where there is a monopoly or a duopoly of providers that can actually deliver anything close to broadband?
It's a funny question in some ways. If someone else had asked me that, I would say, well, your state should have an organization like C-BAN or like the Broadband Coalition in Maine, or local organizing. Iowa's in a pretty good spot. The referendum is annoying and frankly, I think unnecessary. Nonetheless, it is much less of a onerous restriction than we have up here in the land of the gold and the maroon. I think the biggest challenge is that I would bring up, and Katie can bring up other ones, but is I think people are too willing to sit back and hope that Mediacom or Frontier or CenturyLink will solve this problem. I think elected officials don't have a sense how much support there is for a solution like this, as long as it's competently managed. I mean, I don't want to say that every Iowa municipality should go out and do this. They should not. They should study it. They should be very serious in looking at the challenges that are involved with it. But for communities where there's enthusiasm and it would work well, there will need to be citizen mobilization. Local businesses have to organize. These things don't happen because they generally don't happen just because someone on the city council thinks, hey, let's do this thing.
Right.
That will be controversial and create a lot of opponents, and and I'll have to stand for re-election before it's profitable. They need to be pressured into it. So Katie, what are other barriers?
That well, I think citizen awareness is a huge barrier, right? I mean, Todd and I have worked with communities where you've got kind of two approaches to becoming a municipal broadband utility: the bottom up and the top down. The bottom up projects, which are driven by citizens and business owners wanting something better, those are often very successful because the demand is already there. When you have it just with maybe city leaders or key personality in a city hall leading the effort, it may not be as successful because there may just not be, maybe they're not talking to the right people in the community. And so that there might be some skepticism there. Plus, if the community's leadership has a reputation of not delivering, that can also hurt those efforts. So we always try to encourage in the cases, and I know you guys do it, ISLR, to, you should have champions. If you're going to explore a municipal broadband effort, you should have champions that are, regular walk of life folks that are going to be out there pounding the streets and encouraging people to be active and pressuring those leaders to do what's right.
Just a quick note. You hit our, we are supposed to drink every time someone says ISLR. We're ILSR. I don't think you've ever made that mistake.
I do it every time. I'm dyslexic when I come to your cheers.
We do it ourselves.
Yeah.
It's very tempting.
It's one of those 4-letter acronyms that somehow give me issues. Even when I type it, I do that. So apologies to the fine folks at the LSR. I had to think about it there. So access, building new networks, municipalities are playing their role. Some private companies are really stepping up.
I think Katie still had maybe another barrier or two that.
I'm sorry. Yes.
No, I think you nailed it. I think like you both said, it's really essential to have champions both in the community and just within the city internally. We could talk about. There are other challenges that, once a municipal network is in place, that they might have in actually implementing some of these programs. And we could talk about that more. We can move on.
Well, I think that's a really good point because municipalities tend to be very conservative when it comes to how they build projects, how they manage projects. And by conservative, I don't mean politically. It's just they're used to doing things a certain way, and thinking outside the box can be a very big challenge, even to a municipal utility, because it just may, they're always concerned about treating some people differently than others, even though some people have systemically been treated differently in our economy. We all know that, and that's why they can't afford internet. So it's just another barrier, I would say.
Yeah. What I think too, though, that we're seeing a barrier that is coming down has been that city leaders traditionally have focused, just because of how property taxes drive city government, the municipalities have really just focused too much on brick and mortar economy, and they just aren't aware to neither by training, neither by education, even city managers, finance officers, people who go into the line of work, really you focus around tax base. And I think once you get community leaders to understand that you're a barrier to understanding the world of work today, that 30% of your households can make money off the internet. And what the surveys we're seeing is that even if people are just using it as a side hustle, $20 a month, they're paying for their internet connection once they know how to use it. It might just be selling stuff online as a drop-in shipper. But I have students at Simpson College paying for their way through college just on internet-based businesses.
Yep.
And so I think that once you get community leaders to remove that barrier, that their knowledge of their own economy is limited, that then they start getting the support from people who start telling the story about why this matters. And I think they found that out in Tennessee, and especially when they did a big public investment, the amount of 1099 income and the number of 1099s filed at their state income taxes went up quite a bit. And then GDP goes up. And once you have to explain to community leaders, no, GDP is actually me spending money at a restaurant. It's not me building a storefront and hiring 20 people. Because, and then you can actually make money doing that. So I think that is a
Yeah.
barrier that I think groups like yours, are taking the lead on about changing who is elected because of their understanding of the economy.
I would like to build on that a little bit. I think that's very accurate, in part because I think there's a misunderstanding of who is maybe down on their luck and can't afford the connection. I think in many cases we tend to think of them as people who might permanently be unable to join society, compete in the job market and things like that. The evidence doesn't suggest that that's true from what I can tell. It's often people who are there maybe temporarily, and one of the things that I've failed to look up on was I had heard preliminary results from a study that I believe Mike Render had done, who Mike does a lot of research work for broadband communities. And I believe he had found that when there was a segment of the population that suddenly was able to afford internet access, they saw very strong rates of new business formation within them. People who, may have been living in public housing, or they still have ideas. And like you said, Todd, they might, maybe they're selling things or they're doing something. And so it's worth noting that, that connecting everyone shouldn't be viewed as charity. The 1934 Communications Act really gets this right. I think we all benefit when we're all connected. Everyone should have adequate access. And I think adequate, we can define different ways. I would say means roughly that we should all have good access and the ability to do the things we need to do. And we'll all benefit from that by unlocking the potential of each other, rather than presupposing that if I can't afford a higher monthly internet bill, I don't have good ideas to contribute.
Right.
I proposed this the other day in a Zoom meeting about the economy. If we actually live this video-based world for the next 3 years, how's that going to impact your career if you're sitting on a 5 meg choppy dial-up and you're in sales? This is going to be a real issue for people, because we already know that there are people who are more mobile, more fit, and more attractive earn more money and are more outgoing. That's the way the world works.
Thank you.
Let's put this out there even more and say your video connection on how you present that, or able to or not, is actually going to make you less money. I mean, and now you apply that to education, and then you apply it. I mean, I think this COVID thing is really drawing some serious good discussion around these
Well, I see great things in Curtis's future because of that 5G fact sheet behind him that came from a very reputable organization.
I think it's awesome that your eyes are sharp enough to tell that.
You must have a decent connection, or at least your upload is not saturated.
Fiber to the home.
There you go.
So it certainly helps.
But there's one other piece of that too, which is that Mike Curry with SNG has said for more than a decade now, I think, that there is a lot of untapped benefits of connectivity from people who don't understand either how much it benefits them or how to take maximum advantage of it. And I think that is well worth exploring. And related to COVID, Todd, what you're saying made me think of that is we just came from a staff meeting. One of our programs at ILSR focuses on small businesses, and there's evidence that small businesses are seeing much more e-commerce now. We actually heard from a domain registrar that the number of .coms being registered over the past month has exploded beyond historical norms. And they looked into it and found it was businesses that have been long established and never bothered to have a web presence before. So things are changing.
Yeah, even the small town local dive bar that may not have had a presence before, maybe popping it up there because they want to sell carry out pizzas or carry out bar food, so. And they want not that I would have any experience with bars, but just as a hypothetical there, I'll throw that out. So talk a little bit about, we spent a little time talking about the Lifeline program. We also mentioned Universal Service Fund and the money, where that goes. I know that you're probably like me and you're not a real big fan of how those resources have always been deployed. Helping large companies do the very minimum they can in order to receive a subsidy, and then there not always being a lot of good follow-up that they are actually delivering what they promised. Is any of that going to change? Because there's a lot of money out there in the Universal Service Fund that could be used to build new networks that are meeting these needs, or even subsidizing internet for people who can't afford it, but instead it's being used for corporate buyouts and stuff like that. So,
well, let me so we can tackle that in two things. Katie, you want to talk about RDOF, and I'll talk about a recent proposal that we're seeing in Congress?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it is changing, at least in terms of subsidies from the FCC, from the Federal Communications Commission. It's starting to go more to local providers, municipalities, cooperatives, versus just the big guys,
yeah.
large monopoly providers. And I think I'm optimistic that with the upcoming RDOF auction, that we'll see a good amount going to community providers that are interested in building out fiber and doing the most with the limited dollars that they're going to have access to.
Okay.
I thought you were going to correct me, Katie, and correctly note this is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund rather than just confusing people with the.
Yeah.
Well, if you'd have been me, you'd have called it RFOD. So.
Yeah, so that's the Federal Communications Commission's upcoming auction to auction off subsidies to providers, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and it will, not unlike past subsidies, it won't automatically go to providers like AT&T and Windstream and Frontier that just had to say, yeah, we'll take that, and they'll have to actually.
Pardon me, Kate, but it's still not going to be available to a municipal network that wants to build in a community where a existing company is already considered to have broadband.
So yes, the funds.
That's where my program comes in.
Yeah, the funds will only be available to in areas where there is an existing broadband services.
It may be useful to edge out in some cases, and we are hopeful that the Federal Communications Commission, and not just because it has committed to do so, but because Congress has said it must collect better broadband data by the end of the summer. We are hoping that in a year or two, we will have much more fine-grained understanding of where access is, and that would allow more targeted funds to the extent that programs currently will only fund areas where there is no service.
Right.
And they go to great pains and expense to make sure they don't accidentally create competition. Because I think Commissioner O'Reilly's head might explode if that happened.
Yeah, there's definitely not a lot of call for that at the FCC right now.
Right. So, I do think that's moving in the right direction. Reconnect out of USDA is a major program that's largely gone to. I think, Katie, your analysis suggests half of it's gone to cooperatives.
Yeah, cooperatives and municipalities, and I think a tribal provider as well. And then the rest, I think, pretty much. I don't think we've seen it gone to any large provider. I think it's all been more regional or community-based companies and providers.
Now, it's worth noting that a lot of these programs require you to be a provider that has been around, has a track record, audited statements, things like that. It can be challenging for a new provider to get in there. The reason for that is very important, because you would not want to give billions of dollars to a provider, like, I don't know, Frontier, for instance, and then have them declare bankruptcy. That would look really bad. So you want to go to a lot of trouble to make sure you're not giving billions of dollars to providers like Windstream that are declaring bankruptcy. These programs, that's the theory behind them. But the big companies seem to keep getting money no matter how poorly they do, while small providers have more hurdles to jump over. That's a problem. That ties into the program that has been announced by some Democrats in Congress who are pushing forward this idea of $86 billion. This is largely based on the plan that Warren developed, Senator Warren, when she was running for president, and is aimed not only at bringing high quality connectivity to rural areas, but bringing competition to areas in which there's a decent provider, but there may not be a very good a choice, or where you might not have a gigabit, for instance, or 100 megabit high quality connectivity. This program is not fully laid out. It would involve creating a new program at the federal government in order to administer it and deal with it. So it's complicated, and we don't have a lot of the details. But the idea would be that there would be matching funds available, and it would be prioritized to entities like cooperatives and municipalities. So it's worth keeping an eye on. If the Democrats run the table in November, probably nothing could happen before then, but it would be something that may be discussed in 2021, and ideally would see some bipartisan buy-in. But right now, I think it's more about messaging.
Yeah.
So it's not worth getting excited about.
Probably not going to see a lot of bipartisanship for the next few months because of the election coming. So
no, but it does seem like broadband and the whole digital inclusion theme has been one of the more less divisive discussions as we've moved into the more rural areas who are clamoring for it. I mean, we even seen it here in Iowa. At the Iowa legislature this year, I'm on the Technology Association of Iowa's Public Policy Committee, and we were just told that, for the first time, both sides are at the table here in Iowa to say the Rural Farm Bureau wants these farms to work. So let's see what it's going to take. Not that there's, we can argue about what role government will have in the public funding, but we're going to have some role because what's left is needed. And we were at a roundtable that CBAM participated in with one of our representatives who's on that federal committee. And those are just those themes that we hammered on, which was, if you make it matching, that makes our projects a lot more feasible. If you include a little planning money in there about how we're going to do the matching, we'll be able to leverage the money. And so anyway, we had a small town here in Iowa, our little win, Adair, who wants to partner with Casey Mutual, and they actually received for the first time state funding for some of our efforts. So I do think that we probably have everybody's ear for the first time as an industry, partially because we're rural states, and we just need to use that bipartisanship however we can.
I distinguish between bipartisanship at the local level, where we really see
Indeed.
that. You see that so strongly. At the state and federal level, we start to see money, and I think it's unfair to say it's equal on both sides. I think the cable and telephone companies are much more focused on getting Republican support because their message resonates among Republicans, the idea of let the free market work it out and things like that. There's certainly Democrats who just toe the cable line. So I think the challenge is making sure that at the national level and the state level, the elected folks understand that it's not bipartisan at the local level, and they shouldn't go against their base. And so it's our job to make sure that they see there's a calculation to be made there. But one other piece I want to throw in, actually, because I forgot to tie it back to our conversation, the $86 billion plan that Warren developed would also require, if you take that money in a non-rural area, let's say, rather than calling it urban, but a non-rural area, you would be required to provide a $10 a month service or a low income fee as part of the requirements of taking that money. I think it's harder to impose that on more rural areas where business models are really tight. I mean, if you think municipalities have it hard in areas with some density, it gets really, really hard out there in the 3 or 4 homes per linear mile.
Yeah, it certainly does. Do you think that, obviously with COVID here, the nation spent just a whole lot of money trying to mitigate its effects? I'm just curious if we think that there's going to be a lot of $86 billion chunks to reinvest in the community, in the country laying around, or will everybody retrench into deficit fighting mode after this?
Boy, that's going to depend on Democrats from Iowa, Nebraska. I mean, those are the states that'll really swing the balance, I think. I mean, we're definitely in a part of which I just feel like it's all monopoly money.
It's
kind of
become like that
start. Almost. So I don't want to minimize it, because I've long been a person who's just really frustrated at unnecessarily large deficits during good times. I strongly believe in fiscal responsibility, designing programs to spend the least that's possible to get the job done correctly. That said, $86 billion to solve America's broadband problems, I mean, that's a it's a great deal.
Yeah.
And so I say it'll come down to, I think, Midwestern Democrats, because I expect that we'll see Republicans, if they are in the minority, saying debt, 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 deficit, deficit, deficit,
Right.
after having given us that problem. And to be clear, I'm talking about specifically some recent policies, the tax cuts, things like that, that we never hear any of that discussion about. I expect that to happen, and it will be up to the conservative Democrats as to how they want to react if they're worried about putting $86 trillion on the balance sheet. My impression is the most conservative people in Nebraska and Iowa, they want broadband, and for them,
Yes.
I don't
Yes.
think they mind. Like, I mean, this gets down to this classic idea: debt is not debt. There's investments, there's wasted money, there's
Bingo.
and so I don't think anyone's going to pay a price if they actually develop a program that will succeed.
I think that's the challenge, is getting. It's always been a challenge getting policymakers to understand the difference between spending and investment. And we've done a lot of spending over the years that, like you said, didn't really return anything to the citizens, as opposed to an investment, whether it be in roads or bridges or broadband or any of those infrastructure projects. It's always been interesting to me that this nation has never really had a cohesive broadband infrastructure policy like we did with the electrification policies. And if we had, we probably would be further along than we are. And certainly other nations have had a much more cohesive infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, like South Korea and others. So we're in hangover from decisions that were made 25, 30 years ago. So,
yes. And I would just also say that I feel like we're in a time in which people are voting based on the president, rather than what the representative or senator has done for them.
indeed.
And that's also true even down the mayoral elections, and that skews our politics. People have to vote based on actual records. You need to do your homework, see whether you agree or disagree with the person, and not just try to send a message to DC. That, I don't think that's a effective way of using your vote when it comes to this stuff.
It sure hasn't worked in the past, so why would it work now, right? I just we got a couple minutes left, see if we do have any questions from the group. If you have a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and fire a question up, and I'll be monitoring for those if we do have any. Any closing thoughts as we get toward the end here? Katie, Christopher, Todd?
Katie's super radical in her politics. That's why I keep talking. I'm very mainstream, as you can tell.
Anarchist.
Well, I think that's also that definition is constantly shifting too. Who's radical? What was radical 5 years ago is now seen as extremely mainstream on both ends of the spectrum. So,
or insufficient.
yeah.
Well,
3 months ago.
What's that?
Some of it 3 months ago here in Iowa, after
indeed,
the Congress season and lived through the debate for 6 months of what these terms mean.
I'm pretty sure the Iowa caucuses caused COVID because it just broke everything, broke the world.
Well, so from our rivalries aside, you'll see I'm in a maroon room. I am deeply disappointed that we won't have our state fairs this summer, as it looks like.
That's a big deal.
Yes, and I think it is worth noting, the internet has done amazing things to stay up, to keep us going. The service economy is getting destroyed. One of the reasons we're noticing that is because so much more of the economy has been able to be conducted. If this had happened 6 or 7 years ago, the cable networks couldn't have handled it. I mean, absolutely, the congestion, right. If you remember that in the afternoons, and it's not to say that it's over yet. So I feel like these high capacity connections, it's a reminder we need to get them out to everyone. We need to make sure everyone can take advantage of them, because you never know what's around the corner.
Well, the service industry in this nation has always been underappreciated and in many cases looked down on. And unfortunately, this is hurting a lot of them. I think people appreciate it more, and they certainly will if the COVID slowdown leads to a lot of your favorite restaurants and other service-oriented businesses being shuttered after this. Let's just hope that doesn't happen, we can all escape COVID. Hopefully everybody on the call is staying healthy and will continue to stay healthy. So I want to thank you all, Christopher Mitchell and Katie Kienbaum from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, also known as the ILSR. And that's Todd up there in the corner. I'm Curtis Dean. We're with the CBAN, which I can't get wrong because it just rolls off the tongue. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and stay safe, stay healthy, and this recording will be placed on the CBAN website after we get her all edited. So thank you very much.